Good morning. This is October 3rd, and our topic for today is warfare. Not my favorite topic, probably not yours, and certainly for those who are engaged in warfare, or at least the victims of warfare, not theirs either. But there's so much being strewn around about all of this right now that I thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about it. Let me also hasten to say that I'm going to talk about it as a student of international politics and not some kind of expert of weapons systems, etc., which I do not understand and don't care to know details about. I just start with a sort of funny story, which was during the Vietnam War when I was teaching at UCSC up on international politics course. Then there were lots of discussions about different kinds of planes going down or being shot down and so forth. And there were very few women teaching, and some of the male students were trying to goad me, and they would raise their hand and saying, "Is this particular plane better than another particular plane?" And I would, of course, say, "I can't tell one plane from another. You got to ask somebody else about that." So they were constantly goading me about my lack of knowledge of details about weapon systems. Anyway, I want to talk about the larger picture today, and actually in a sort of backwards way. I mean, what is discussed today is will or will not the Russians use limited nuclear weapons of one kind or another. And this is serious business because since the U.S. used nukes in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no nuclear weapons have been deployed, or maybe deployed, but not used. And now there's some serious discussion that Russia might use a targeted, small scale, but still nuclear weapon. In which case the question then arises, will the Nato then respond and the Ukrainians respond also with nuclear weapons, in which case we have World War III and it would be a nuclear war. So part of the discussion, of course, is supposing the Russians are not deterred from using a nuclear weapon, what are the implications and how do we think about this? Let me backtrack by saying when Ukraine became independent, it gave up all its nuclear capacity, and all the nuclear capacity other than civilian use was moved into Russia, right? Because before that, the Ukrainians had nuclear capacity. So now it's just Russia. Now, it was decided in 1968 to have a nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which originally 40 countries signed, and I think there are now 191 signatures, of everybody promising that they're not going to use nuclear weapons. And that seemed to be in everybody's interest. There were some countries which refused to sign this treaty, Pakistan and India, and by the way, both of them became nuclear countries that have nuclear capacity. And they sort of argued that this wasn't really right. The countries that already had nuclear weapons were allowed to keep them, but the others were prevented from having them, and so they didn't sign. Another country, then the question is, who all has nuclear weapons? Well, US, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China. Are those really the only countries? Probably not. Almost everybody thinks Israel has nuclear weapons, but it hasn't acknowledged having them. In the past, South Africa had nuclear weapons and gave them up. And Libya had nuclear weapons and gave them up under Gaddafi, which of course led then not only to the demise of Gaddafi, but the mess in Libya. So people look at this and say, well, that wasn't such a smart move. Southern Sudan, when it came independent, didn't sign the treaty. And of course, now there is the discussion with Iran. That is to say, at the moment, Iran does not as yet have nuclear weapons, but is very close to having them. And we've discussed this before and will do so again. Now, who is looking after this treaty? In fact, meaning most countries have denuclearized in terms of, or never developed nuclear weapons. It's the International Atomic Energy Agency. The International Atomic Energy Agency is an arm of the United Nations. And you might have noticed on the news that they have inspected and made inspections in Iran. And that was part of the treaty with Iran, which has now fallen apart unless there is because Trump got the US out of that agreement that they wouldn't develop nuclear capacity. But in any event, their nuclear abilities are very close, conventional. And so the question is, will there be a new treaty which stops Iran from becoming a nuclear power? So there are things lurking out there which suggests that more countries could become nuclear. Let me just hasten to say, you might have noticed that the IAEA inspectors came to Ukraine, and their role is not simply to inspect nuclear weapons situations, but nuclear capacity in general, including civilian and nuclear capacity for electricity, etc. And that has been an issue in Ukraine, as you might know, because while that's not part of warfare, it has become part of warfare because the Russians are occupying the largest nuclear facility in Europe, which happens to be in Ukraine. And you might have noticed in the news recently that the staffing of that nuclear plant is still in Ukrainian hands, but the plant is occupied by the Russians. And the Ukrainian head of the management of that plant was just arrested this last week, and who knows what's going to happen to him. So what I'm saying is, on the one hand, they're in the nuclear capacity states, and warfare has been since the Second World War, or towards the end of the Second World War, has not been used. But there's countries that could use nuclear weapons, and of course Russia is one of them. And this is the first time really that a country is threatening not just to have nuclear weapons, but to actually use them. So this is really serious business, and it means that while lots of warfare has taken place, lots of civil wars and even interstate wars over the last decade, it's really the first time that we're discussing the possibility of warfare with nuclear weapons, not just people having them and possibly using them, or using them as leverage to get what they want with other states, but actually using them in a conflict. So we're in a new ballgame with warfare. But we're also in a new ballgame with warfare in general, because one of the things that was noteworthy is that the Western US-dominated capacity to build various missile systems and tank types and all kinds of weaponry was embedded in the Western countries, namely NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And NATO has, its name is North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so many of the countries in Europe, and as countries became independent from the Soviet Union, all joined NATO. And so you've got about 30 countries that are part of NATO. The original groupings of NATO included Canada and Turkey, which is relevant, and I will get to in a minute. And now Sweden and Finland wants to join, and a couple of days ago, Ukraine announced again that it wants to join. Now, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was meant to prevent future war, and certainly future nuclear war, and it has built into it a structure, a NATO structure. The organization of NATO is located in Brussels, and it has a bureaucratic as well as military structure, but it's also the case that all the NATO countries have to be prepared and have to be budgetarily prepared to contribute to NATO if there is a conflict that NATO gets involved with. Well, what kind of conflict does NATO get involved with? Well, theoretically, the kind that we're talking about in Ukraine, except that NATO is meant to address and protect fellow NATO countries. And as we know, even though the Ukraine would badly like to join NATO, it is not a member. So while NATO is supplying Ukraine with all kinds of military warfare capacity, NATO itself is not as yet involved in fighting in Ukraine. And one of the questions that arises from the discussion, will the Russian use nuke in Ukraine, is once that happens, will NATO feel that it needs forced itself to get involved? Because this will be a breach from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and from all the various other treaties that pertain to warfare in the post-World War II era, all the international law and so forth, and all the organizations. So in many ways, NATO has been helping the Ukraine without physically getting involved. Now that's a sort of, swishy category, because NATO has been supplying arms and training to the Ukrainians without actually going into the Ukraine. And that raises another question about warfare, and that is, in order to have the capacity nationally, but also have the capacity with allies, military hardware and to some extent software has to be aligned and has to be usable. Now, the Russians are big producers of arms and have supplied many countries with arms, including, I might say, India right now. India uses Russian military arms, and that's one of the reasons why India is often voting to abstain and so forth, because its military arsenal is largely Russian hardware. And since India imagines that it could be going to war with Pakistan, it's important for India not to foreclose its access to the military purchases and donations to some extent that it has with the Russians. And of course, East European countries, while they were still part of the Soviet Union, all had their military hardware was supplied by the Russians. And NATO has essentially Western, often American and English and French military supplies. But even if they had other suppliers of one kind or another, there was a way of integrating the arms of NATO members in case somebody was attacked. And if for NATO had something called the tripwire concept, namely an attack on one is an attack on all. That is to say, all members of NATO need to come to the rescue and to the support of any NATO member that has been attacked. Again, the Ukraine is not part of it, but almost all the former Soviet East European countries, when they were part of the Soviet Union, were not part of the system. Now they're part of the system. But being part of the system, you have everybody from Estonia to Poland and so forth, means that largely their supply of planes and missiles and all the rest are Russian-made rather than Western-made. And that raised an interesting question for the Ukraine, which was the Ukrainians also had Russian military supplies, right? So that when the West and when NATO started saying, we're going to help you chaps against this Russian invasion of your country, the help came from Western supplied arms. And the Ukrainians didn't know how to use them. And you might remember early in this conflict, there was this problem of Ukrainians having to rush to Poland to be trained in the use of Western weaponry, because by now Poland had some Western weaponry, and also NATO countries could help train the Ukrainians. So without making this too detailed and too complex, I just want to say, when countries come from different directions in terms of their warfare capacity, it's difficult to align them, because the military, the armies, and the military command don't know how to use these systems. So by now, since the war in Ukraine has been taking place for some time, the Ukrainians have been trained up in the use of American Western use of missiles and tanks and long range, short range, and so forth weaponry. This sort of is not something that, one is terribly interested in Santa Cruz necessarily, but the complexity of contemporary warfare and the complexity of, it's not just, you pick up a gun and you shoot them. These missile systems, these long-range missiles, short-range missiles, complicated tanks, and their shooting capacity and supply of them and so forth. It was very difficult to integrate and overlap these Western systems when the Ukraine had to move from the resupply from Russia and move to the supplying of Western and NATO forces. Now, because Ukraine is using both Russian and Western weaponry like Mad Hatters, it needs to be resupplied. And so now the question in terms of warfare is, to what extent is there international capacity for NATO to keep supplying, and the US as part of NATO, to keep supplying people with the weaponry so they can actually be used, and Russia's having the same problems. Some of this is very high tech. It requires chips and so forth. Even the Russians are short of chips, which they bought from countries that are not now selling them, and they don't produce some of these on their own. So, for example, and again, I don't want to get too detailed, for example, right now, the Iranians, which are friendly with the Russians and also want to take a stand against NATO and the West, are supplying the Russians with drones, right? So Russians are getting external help and supply. How much the Chinese are supplying is not clear, if at all. The North Koreans are probably supplying them to some extent. So supplies and reservoir of the technology needed for warfare is becoming a serious question. And right now there are discussions in NATO and there are discussions in the United States how to ramp up the industries which produce these weapons in such a way that the countries that are supplying the Ukraine are not bereft of their own weapon stockpiles in case they need them for something else. I mean, supposing the US, let's say just hypothetically, the Chinese actually move into Taiwan and we want to supply East Asian countries with more weaponry of one kind or another. Do we have the supplies in stock because so much of it has been moved overseas? Obviously, the corporations that produce weapons in the United States and elsewhere are doing extremely well. And if you have stocks in those, you probably know that the earnings are now very high. An industry that some of us who are not very prone to be supportive of things military can decry. But as we speak, both the English, the French, the American are ramping up the production of military things, from missiles to drones to, I don't know, whatever the tanks shoot, et cetera, et cetera. So warfare nowadays has become globalized. It's not just globalized because everybody's at war. It's become globalized because in order to transact warfare, other than, let's say, guerrilla warfare internal to some country, and even there, drones and so forth are supplied from other countries, has become internationalized because technology has been internationalized. And you can, you can be anti-globalization and all of this and say every country should produce its own weapon systems and so forth. But we have treaties like NATO, which obliges countries to cooperate. And of course, getting together gives you more leverage in case you need to engage in warfare somewhere. So warfare and how to transact warfare has very much changed. It's not, some little war between two countries in some corner of the world. We now have to think, can it be escalated to the use of nuclear weapons? And even when nuclear weapons aren't used, the complexity of the technology of contemporary warfare is mind-boggling. It really is mind-boggling. And requires a lot of expertise. And it isn't just the weapons in the hands of soldiers. It is also, for example, communications systems. There are all kinds of treaties that I don't want to bore you with that govern air traffic, conventional civilian air traffic, military air traffic. Where can military planes fly over what land? Can somebody stop them from flying over a particular country, and so on? So both the transportation as well as technology of communication, computers, the whole management of drones, which requires all kinds of sophisticated technologies, allows nowadays. For example, let me give you a non-Ukrainian example. We used drones in Afghanistan, which was probably a big mistake because we were first to do this in Afghanistan. And the people who operated the drones were sitting in Nevada somewhere, right? And they targeted, and you might remember not just in Afghanistan, but various places in the Middle East, Al-Qaeda leaders were hit in their homes by drones sent from the United States. And as I said, people sitting in the United States were targeting a particular house that intelligence has designated. This is sophisticated stuff, and it's scary stuff. And it used to be, in scary movies, but we're now having warfare that resembles, the scary movies that people used to go to, Cinema 9 or now Santa Cruz Cinema to watch, because you have missiles, you have drones, you have chips required for transacting modern warfare, which are not produced in the country that needs to use them. You have to step up the use of the production of these chips. These chips, as we know, not just from warfare, but also from domestic technology, are produced, God knows, in South Korea and other places, Taiwan. If there's interference, all of a sudden, the TVs can't be put together, or as you might have noticed in the news, certain cars can't be sold because they're missing chips and the chips haven't arrived, or they have from some other country in the world. So the technological interdependence has fundamentally changed warfare, and not just, what arms are available and how many soldiers are there, etc. What's so confusing about the contemporary world is that what we read about is, these hapless Russian soldiers out there in the Ukraine getting shot up and getting killed, and the soldiers before they get killed, killing Ukrainians, and there are 40 bodies maimed and whatnot in graves. And that all sort of harks back to almost ancient times, 20th century times. And you think we've moved past all of that. But in point of fact, warfare nowadays, it happens at the most basic, rudimentary. A soldier with little training, in the case of Russians in Ukraine, with a rifle, killing some local person in the village. And that looks very much like, things that have happened for decades and centuries. And then you have this incredible 21st century technology going on simultaneously. It is very confusing. It is very complex. And it has led really to warfare having to be thought of in very different ways. And of course, on the flip side of all of this is the whole machinery after the Second World War, which developed international law, which says you can't do this, you couldn't do that, this is illegal, crimes against humanity, you're not supposed to hit civilians, you're not to do this, you're not to do that. And of course, all these things have been more or less violated in the war in the Ukraine. And the question is, why isn't the international law deterring people from behaving in ways which are tantamount to internationally illegal by the standards of international law? Well, we can all be cynical in saying very often international law is voluntarily adhered to because people conceive it to be in their self-interest to have an orderly war where bad things don't happen to civilians, for example. But it's also the case that sometimes people don't care. And for example, let's say the US didn't care. They violated all kinds of international law. In the case of Afghanistan, you could argue that the violations in Abu Ghraib in Iraq were violations, they're definitely violations of international law. You can argue that Guantanamo raises all kinds of questions about the legality of the US doing what it's doing or not doing by having these people locked up forever without a trial. It's also a violation of international law. But then, it's if one is a Westerner, American, European, one says, well, these were violations, but they were small scale compared to what's happening in the Ukraine. The other thing to be said about it is when individuals violate international law, or countries violate international law, has anything ever happened to them? And of course, there's the International Criminal Court, which we talked about in the past, where individuals who, for example, in Rwanda engaged in genocide to this day are being tried and convicted. People in the war in the Balkans, Serbs, Croatians, and remember all of that. Individuals, including leaders, were tried in The Hague and convicted and imprisoned. So individuals over some period of time sometimes are convicted under international law. But when there are massive violations, such as happening in the Ukraine, the question is, at which point and in how many years will anybody be tried, either under any of the international laws or in The Hague or in the International Criminal Court or in the International Court of Justice? And since it usually takes a long time and not many people get captured, it obviously does not serve as a deterrent, for example, for the Russians to annex part of the Ukraine. So while international law is meant to be not only tell people what they may or may not do, and the capacity to try people, the mechanisms exist to try people, the question is, how much of a deterrent is it? All right. And so let me now just end by going back to the beginning. The use of a nuclear weapon in Ukraine by the Russians is a violation of international law and laws that the Russians said they would adhere to. If they're not going to adhere to them, will others be willing to then respond in kind? it is not clear what is going to happen. And, people are speculating. Will Putin actually, saber rattle on this issue, but not engage in using even a limited nuclear weapon in the Ukraine? Will he be deterred by the history since the Second World War and what he anticipates will happen? Much of the speculation of those who are, think about these things is that even if they used a nuclear weapon, the NATO would not respond with a nuclear weapon, but rather would respond by NATO getting involved in the Ukraine. But that's another story, and no one is 100% sure who thinks about these issues knowledgeably and deeply is sure that this will not escalate and we might not have major international nuclear conflict. Let us hope that doesn't happen, but in the meantime, let us keep an eye on the fact that the way we used to think about wars has radically changed, and the Ukrainian situation has helped to change both the thinking about it, national policies about it, NATO policies about it. Probably the Chinese are rethinking what they would do and would not do. So we are in a new ball game, and it is not clear how this will play itself out. Thank you for listening, and talk to you again in 2 weeks.